What you're looking at right here was once the most luxurious palace in Europe, unlike anything the world had seen. It had a grand ballroom, cathedral, and an indoor garden filled with exotic plants from around the world. But it gets better. The entire estate was surrounded by some of the most beautiful parks in Europe. Man-made canals connected a series of navigable artificial ponds used to tour the guests around on boats, so that they could enjoy the hundreds of world-class sculptures found throughout the parks. And yet, the most unlikely thing about this entire story was its origin. Against all odds, a disfigured industrialist, known for his disliking of children, took in an orphan girl from the impoverished class and left her his entire empire. And in a time when women still couldn't vote, she cascaded that fortune into a noble dynasty. So, where did it all go wrong? How could the legacy of the richest woman in Europe end up in such ruin? And what, if anything, can be done to save it? Stay tuned to find out as we explore the ruins of Europe's most beautiful lost palace. I'm your host Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. The entire story of this palace starts here at the grand entrance. For it was from within these doors that the richest woman in Europe controlled her empire, and how she came to power is like something out of a fiction movie.
The story of Joanna Gryzik von Schonberg-Gaudula started in 1842 when she was born. When she was 3 years old, her father died. Her mother had two options: or she would have another husband, or she will give her children to the orangery.
After facing a series of very difficult stepfathers who did very terrible things, Joanna's mother ultimately opted for the latter of the two bad options. And in 1946, the young girl was taken into the household of the industrialist Schonberg-Gaudula, who you can think of as something like the European equivalent of Rockefeller.
She also did not inform Schonberg-Gaudula that small Joanna would live in his house because he hated children.
Even so, Joanna was pawned off on one of the servants, and when the industrialist eventually found out that a child was living in his home, he was furious and demanded that the child be removed. Historians have debated why he disliked children so much, and many have speculated that in a bizarre way, it all came down to the fact that he was very homely. Allow me to explain. Some years prior, the Titan was brutally attacked by a gang of disgruntled workers who left him permanently disfigured. He lost an eye, had a crippled arm, and from that point forward, walked with a severe limp. Understandably, this trauma caused him to withdraw entirely from social life, so he lived alone, had no wife or children, and was rumored by the locals to be in a league with the devil because of his immense wealth and horrific looks. So just to clarify, this guy looked like a goddamn monster. His face was scarred, he was ugly, and children were afraid of him. So he didn't want children around him, assumingly, because he didn't want to be reminded of his ugliness. But somehow, Joanna was able to win his heart. Legend has it that everything changed when the young girl ran up to the terrifying industrialist without a shred of fear and gave him some flowers that she picked from the garden. From that point forward, he grew deeply fond of her and began to treat Joanna like his own daughter, educating her, and perhaps unbeknownst to the child, preparing her for one of the greatest inheritance in history.
One day before his death, he wrote his will, but in his will there was one part. If Joanna wouldn't have children, all money, all fortune will be for Gaudula's sisters. You can imagine that these children was treated like something unnecessary, and there were a lot of tries to kill her.
Considering that, Joanna had to spend many years hidden away in a seminary so that no one could take her life before she could become a mother. However, in the end, she married, achieved noble status, and continued her family's bloodline. The empire was secure, and she was sure to keep things that way, to the point that she basically set up a prenup with her husband.
The day before marriage, they signed an agreement in which had guaranteed that this fortune will be still her, not her husband after the marriage.
Really?
So there was a point in this agreement. Here she decided about everything.
Between 1863 and 1897, the then teenaged heiress Joanna and her new husband, Hans, purchased the historic Kopnica manor and transformed it into a breathtaking palace, where she embraced the Neo-Gothic and French Neo-Renaissance architecture. The home featured 365 rooms, and seemed to float seamlessly on a network of reflection ponds, surrounded by a lush 70-hectare English landscape park, complete with an artificial medieval ruin, a massive palm house, and hundreds of life-sized sculptures. You might even say that Kopnica stood as a dazzling fairy tale monument to the couple's boundless industrial fortune. As for gestures of power, those were summarized in the asymmetrical spiked towers, bringing us back to that rather progressive noble marriage.
You can really appreciate the different scale of the his and her tower. And that's like, in the 1980s and 90s, when women were kind of like coming into force in the workplace, they'd wear shoulder pads to be bigger. Forget about the shoulder pads. That's the husband's tower, okay? Now let's have a look at the wife's tower. So the point is, when this palace was in its prime, women could not vote. But in some cases, particularly in this case, they had a lot of influence. And that was symbolized in making something so much larger. But his is pretty nice.
During its prime, Kopnica Palace became the cultural epicenter of the region. The ballroom served as a venue where political alliances were forged, artistic masterpieces were commissioned, and European royalty rubbed shoulders with the region's industrial elite.
It looks like something from a movie, I'd like to see this from the inside. That's very interesting. Was this stained glass?
Glass, yes. It was stained glass, very colorful, probably.
They built their own world here, it was like a bubble of luxury, recreation, and influence.
Yeah, because normally they lived in Wrocław, but Wrocław was a very noisy city, so that's why they searched for another place.
The palace regularly hosted the highest class of European nobility, perhaps most notably Crown Prince and later Emperor Frederick Wilhelm III, who was known to be a guest. Banquets were held in the Grand Dining Hall, which featured sweeping floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the reflecting ponds. Following dinners featuring game hunted directly on the estate, guests moved to the lavish ballroom, where events could last until dawn, and we can assume that when the sun came up, many would take in the morning sun from the balcony overlooking the tennis courts.
You guys probably noticed that I have this hard hat on. It's actually become obligatory for these adventures, but it's not the only thing that I need when I'm out filming. In fact, recently, I've been using a new eSIM service called Sally, and it is fantastic. Not only is it affordable, but it's simple to use. All I do is I open my phone, switch on the app, connect the line, and I am connected to the rest of the world with data. But it's not only a data connection plan, you can also get eSIM phone numbers and use it for things like two-step verification when you're traveling. There's also a built-in ad blocker which can save you up to 28% of your data usage when you're abroad. So if you're headed abroad, make sure that you download the Sally app by clicking on this QR code so that you can stay connected. Thank you so much, Sally, for sponsoring the episode. But now, back to our adventure.
By the time Joanna passed away in 1910 at the age of 68 and was followed by her husband a few years later, the couple had made history. Joanna had grown her original inheritance into a vast fortune. The palace she built not only defined politics, but it was also a treasure for academia. The library was globally renowned for its collection of over 10,000 rare volumes and museum-grade archives, featuring historical armor, rare coins, and master paintings. Accordingly, artists, historians, and scientists were regularly invited to stay at the palace for weeks at a time in order to utilize these private, prized resources for their research. But with the founders gone, the estate would fall apart in just a matter of decades. After passing as inheritance through 3 generations, by 1943, the palace technically belonged to Joanna's great-grandson, who was just 16 years old at the time. Now, because he was still a minor, he could not legally take control of the family fortune, and so the day-to-day management of the estate was temporarily assumed by his mother. However, before her son ever reached adulthood, the family was forced to flee the area from the advancing Soviet Red Army in February of 1945, effectively ending their reign at Kopnica forever.
Well, basically, when the Second World War happened, the Russians were approaching this area. The family here knew that they were in some pretty grave trouble, so they left. The Russians, surprisingly to their credit, did not plunder or destroy this palace, which is pretty unusual because a lot of the palaces in the area met a much uglier fate. However, after the Second World War, when communism took over this region and this land became Poland, no one really knew what the future would hold because Germany didn't recognize the newly gained Polish land until like the 1960s. So no one was trying to invest in old palaces. They had other priorities in rebuilding.
So the then communist Polish government elected to use the site as a summer camp, since notions of nobility really had no place in that type of system. And although they would whitewash the walls and made some aesthetically disappointing changes to the structure, the real damage wouldn't happen until the 1950s, when the palace became a storage facility. And although that might sound absurd, the local communist authorities decided that the massive 365-room palace was simply too large to use for seasonal youth camps. So to maximize the use of nationalized state property, the ground floor and several large halls were co-opted by local state administrators as high-capacity government agricultural warehouses for storing things like grain and crop yields. And although that might sound reasonable, you have to remember, communist states don't typically work as advertised. Allegedly, behind the scenes, the corrupt state administrators began skimming from the inventory and illicitly selling the state-owned grain back to the black market for personal profit. However, by the autumn of 1956, those scammers learned that a strict, high-level government inspection of the facility's inventory was scheduled for a Monday morning in October. Realizing that the massive deficit of grain bags would instantly land them in communist prison, they chose a rather radical exit strategy. On Sunday morning, just 24 hours before the auditors were set to arrive, the corrupt officials intentionally sabotaged the palace. They systematically doused the complex's highly flammable, historic wooden roof beams with oil at 4 separate locations. To guarantee total destruction, they went as far as to completely drain the palace's surrounding ponds, leaving the incoming fire brigades with little but a muddy pit.
There was an illegal business here. The business was facing inspection, and unfortunately, instead of just removing the illegal activities, they burnt the goods. They burnt the whole thing down.
They say the fire burnt for 24 hours, and when the flames went out, almost nothing of value remained. Further plundering took place in the years that followed, with precious statues and garden objects disappearing, only to never be seen again. And although items thought to be associated with the palace occasionally reappear in private collections or on the black market, no one is really sure of their fate.
Well, I think we've seen it all, but this is all that remains of a great noble fortune. And although it was very, very close to being completely lost, considering how many statues and relics are missing, you might even say it has been lost. But the people here are working hard to rebuild. And so I'm certainly keeping my fingers crossed that it will be successful. Thank you all very much for watching. I really hope that you liked the episode. Make sure that you hit the subscribe button so that you don't miss what we do next. Otherwise, as always, this is Ryan Socash, signing off.